The list reached my desk on a Tuesday morning, folded into a thin manila folder that felt heavier than it should have. 14 names, 14 former members of the same remote community, scattered across 3 states, all dead within 72 hours of leaving it. Different methods, different locations, same ending: suicide, cardiac arrest, acute serotonin toxicity, the kind of diagnoses that close cases quickly if you don't look too hard. I looked too hard. What bothered me wasn't the deaths themselves, it was the timing. People don't unravel on a schedule unless something inside them has been wound tight. Each file showed the same pattern: confusion within hours, panic by day 2, and by day 3, collapse. Friends described them as terrified, inconsolable, begging for something they couldn't name. One voicemail transcript ended with a man whispering, "It's gone. I can't make it come back." The community they left called itself Eternal Joy. No criminal record, no weapons, no disappearances. Just people who arrived unhappy and left, briefly alive. As I lined up the photos, 14 faces stared back at me, calm in their final ID shots, like they had already accepted something the rest of us hadn't. That was when I realized this wasn't about death. It was about what happens when you take something away that the human brain decides it cannot live without. I spent the next 48 hours buried in timelines, medical reports, and interview transcripts, chasing the kind of connections that only appear when you stop trusting coincidence. On the surface, the cases resisted each other: different ages, different histories, different breaking points. But when I stripped the files down to symptoms and hours, a shape began to form. The first 12 hours after departure were always quiet. Relief. Even. Former members reported feeling normal again, whatever that meant to them. By hour 24, anxiety set in, restlessness, tremors, an unshakable sense of loss. At 36 hours, cognition degraded, speech patterns fractured. Several victims complained of unbearable pressure in their skulls, like something trying to escape. By the second night, panic became total, heart rate spiked, sleep vanished, hallucinations appeared. Not visual, but emotional, overwhelming dread without an object. Doctors treated what they saw: benzodiazepines, SSRIs, sedation. None of it worked. By hour 72, the body gave up trying to regulate itself. What disturbed me most was what wasn't there. No history of substance abuse, no shared trauma, no suicide notes that made sense. Instead, there were fragments, drawings of empty rooms, texts asking how to turn it back on, recordings of people sobbing like children who'd lost a parent. Patterns don't lie. People do. Paperwork does. Institutions do. Biology doesn't. Whatever Eternal Joy was giving these people, it wasn't comfort, it was replacement. And once installed, the brain treated its absence as a fatal injury. The decision to visit the compound was framed as routine, but nothing about the preparation felt normal. No warrants, no tactical briefings, just a polite notification to a wellness community and an open invitation to observe. That alone should have set off alarms. Groups with nothing to hide usually hide better than this. The drive took us through miles of empty desert, the kind of landscape that strips thought down to essentials. Heat warped the horizon. Cell service died quietly, without ceremony. When Eternal Joy finally appeared, it wasn't fortified or secluded. No gates, no guards, just low white buildings arranged like a retreat center. Doors wide open to the sun. That was the first thing I noticed. Nothing was keeping people in. Residents greeted us without suspicion. They smiled, Not the forced kind, but the relaxed expression of people who slept well and woke up unafraid. They spoke slowly, carefully, as if words were no longer weapons. One woman laughed when I asked how long she'd been there. "Long enough," she said, and didn't elaborate. I walked the perimeter twice. No fences, no cameras, no obvious barriers. Anyone could leave at any time. And yet, standing there, watching people move with unhurried certainty, I felt the unsettling truth settle in my chest. You don't need walls when the outside world no longer feels survivable. Morning at Eternal Joy arrived without sound. No traffic, no distant machinery, not even the nervous buzz of insects fighting the heat. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was deliberate, like a held breath. The buildings were modest, sun-bleached structures spaced evenly across the sand, their windows uncovered, their doors unlocked. Nothing suggested secrecy. That was what unsettled me. We were given a brief orientation by a resident, not staff. She spoke softly, explaining schedules for meals, meditation, and integration periods, as if this were a college campus instead of a place linked to 14 deaths. No one watched us closely. No one followed. People drifted past with easy smiles, barefoot, unhurried, eyes clear in a way that felt studied rather than natural. I noticed how still everyone was. Not rigid, just settled, as if they had reached the end of some long internal argument and decided never to raise their voices again. When the wind passed through, it carried the faint scent of disinfectant and something organic. Damp, hidden beneath the dryness of the desert. I kept waiting for tension to surface, for cracks in the calm. It never did. The compound didn't feel abandoned or guarded. It felt complete, self-contained, like a system that no longer required the outside world to function. That was when it occurred to me. Silence isn't the absence of noise. Sometimes, it's what remains after all resistance has been removed. It took less than an hour to notice the smiles. They came too quickly, settled too comfortably on faces that should have shown at least a trace of suspicion. When I asked routine questions, how long they'd been here, what brought them in, people answered honestly, but without friction. No defensiveness, no hesitation, just openness, polished smooth. One man told me he used to wake up angry for no reason. A woman said she hadn't cried in years, not because she was numb, but because she no longer needed to. They spoke about past pain, the way people talk about bad weather from another country. Acknowledged, distant, irrelevant. Trauma was referenced, never revisited. What disturbed me most wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't. No one expressed doubt. No one joked darkly or complained in passing. There were no emotional spikes, no sarcasm, no edge. Even laughter arrived softly, controlled, like it had been pre-approved by the body before reaching the mouth. I started asking questions designed to provoke discomfort, regret, fear, anger. The responses stayed level, calm, pleasant. A woman met my eyes and smiled as I pressed harder, as if she could sense my intent and found it unnecessary. People are messy when they're honest. These people were clean, too clean. And as I stood among them, surrounded by easy smiles and gentle voices, I felt an unfamiliar chill settle in. Joy isn't supposed to be this quiet. The unease didn't arrive as fear. It crept in as something subtler, more insulting to my instincts. Envy, as the afternoon stretched on. I caught myself watching the residents when they thought no one was looking. Their posture never collapsed inward. No nervous habits, no unconscious self-protection. It was as if the constant background tension I'd learned to ignore my entire life had been surgically removed from them. I tested the edges of the illusion. I asked about conflict, about loss, about what happened when someone broke the rules. The answers came calmly, uniformly. Problems were processed. Anger was examined. Suffering was temporary. Words stripped of teeth. Words that explained everything while meaning nothing. I noticed something else then. People didn't linger near the exits. Paths curved inward, toward common spaces, toward each other. Doors stood open, yet no one hovered near them. Freedom was present in theory, irrelevant in practice. The realization hit me quietly, like a wrong note in a familiar song. No one here was being restrained. They were being convinced. Whatever eternal joy offered, it wasn't enforced through fear or obedience. It was reinforced through relief. As the sun dipped lower, the compound glowed warm and serene against the desert. And standing there, surrounded by people who no longer carried visible pain, I felt my first true alarm. Not because they might be trapped, but because, for a moment, I understood why they wouldn't want to leave. Marcus Webb didn't look like a man hiding anything. He wore simple clothes, clean but worn, and greeted us with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. No security detail, no rehearsed speech. He shook my hand and met my eyes without flinching, like he'd already decided I wasn't a threat. He told his story without prompting. Years in pharmaceuticals, executive bonuses, clinical trials designed to manage symptoms instead of solving problems. He spoke about depression and anxiety the way engineers talk about faulty code. Systems pushed beyond tolerances, never redesigned. Eventually, he said, he realized the industry didn't want cures. Cures ended revenue streams. So I left, he said simply. I wanted to fix the system, not rent it back to people. There was no bitterness in his voice, just certainty. He described eternal joy as a corrective measure, not a rebellion, a place where human neurochemistry could finally operate as intended, free from chronic stress and inherited trauma. He didn't call it enlightenment or salvation. He called it optimization. As he spoke, residents passed by, greeting him warmly, not reverently, no bowed heads, no fear. He wasn't their god. He was their architect. That was what unsettled me. Marcus Webb didn't sound like a fanatic. He sounded like a man who truly believed he had found a better version of reality and felt morally obligated to share it. Marcus spoke about unhappiness the way oncologists speak about tumors, with detachment sharpened by long familiarity. He didn't romanticize suffering or frame it as growth. To him, misery wasn't meaningful. It was mechanical, a malfunction passed down through generations, reinforced by trauma, stress, and a society that normalized pain because it didn't know what else to do with it. Sadness has utility, he told me as we walked. Chronic unhappiness doesn't. That's pathology. He explained it patiently, almost kindly. The human brain, he said, was never designed for constant threat, isolation, and overstimulation. Modern life broke it. Eternal joy didn't numb emotion. It corrected the imbalance, removed resistance, allowed joy to become the default state instead of a rare reward. I challenged him on consent, on dependency, on whether erasing suffering erased something essential. He listened, nodded, and then asked me how many people I'd interviewed who begged to feel normal again. How many cases ended because someone couldn't carry the weight anymore. We treat diabetes without asking patients to embrace high blood sugar, he said. Why is despair sacred? There was no anger in his tone, just quiet logic. And standing there, hearing unhappiness reduced to a diagnosis instead of an identity. I felt the ground shift slightly beneath my feet, because part of me couldn't immediately prove him wrong. I asked him the question I'd been holding back since we arrived. What happens if someone decides this isn't for them anymore? Marcus stopped walking. Not abruptly, deliberately. He turned to face me with the calm patience of a man who'd answered this before. "They leave," he said. "No paperwork, no penalties, no shame." I told him about the 14 deaths, watched his expression carefully. There was no surprise, only a tightening around the eyes, like someone acknowledging a known complication. He didn't deny responsibility. He reframed it. "When you remove life support," he said, "the body doesn't always survive the transition. That doesn't mean the support was evil." I pushed harder. Choice meant nothing if the alternative was death. Marcus nodded, almost sadly. He asked me how free a person with severe depression really was, how voluntary addiction to misery was more ethical than dependency on relief. "You're free to starve," he said. "Freedom doesn't make starvation humane." The conversation ended there, not with tension, but with something worse, mutual understanding. He wasn't forcing anyone to stay. He was offering them a reality so tolerable that leaving felt like self-harm. As we parted, he looked at me and said, quietly, "Choice only matters when both options are survivable." That was the moment I realized this case wouldn't end with handcuffs, only questions. The consent form was short. Too short. 2 pages of clinical language that reduced risk to percentages and side effects to bullet points. No threats, no pressure. Marcus made a point of stepping out of the room while I read it, as if absence itself proved integrity. I signed anyway. Officially. It was for observational purposes. Unofficially, I needed to know what 14 people had chosen over their previous lives. The administration room felt closer to a clinic than a ritual space. White walls, stainless steel tray, a small glass vial holding a clear liquid that caught the light without reflecting it. The resident administering the dose checked my vitals with gentle efficiency, smiling as if this were no more significant than a vitamin injection. I remember the moment before it entered my bloodstream. A flicker of doubt. Not fear. Anticipation, the kind you feel standing at the edge of deep water, knowing you can still turn back. I didn't. The sensation arrived gradually, spreading warmth without heat. No rush, no distortion. My breathing slowed on its own. Muscles loosened I hadn't realized were clenched. Thoughts that normally overlapped and collided began to line up. Orderly and quiet. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was the most alarming part. Because within minutes, I understood exactly why people stayed. It felt like remembering something I'd never known. Not happiness. Something cleaner. The constant internal friction that defined my days simply stopped. No struggle to focus. No defensive scanning of the room. My mind settled into itself, the way dust settles after movement ceases. I became aware of how loud my thoughts had always been, only because they weren't anymore. Memories surfaced without sting. Old cases, faces I'd failed. They appeared intact, factual, stripped of guilt. I could examine them without bracing for impact. The relief was profound, not intoxicating. It didn't ask for celebration. It asked for rest. Time stretched. I noticed details with effortless clarity. The hum of electricity in the walls. The rhythm of my own heartbeat. The precise weight of my body in the chair. Everything existed without urgency. For the first time in years. Nothing inside me demanded immediate resolution. A part of me recognized the danger. Another part didn't care. The internal argument I'd lived with for decades, between responsibility and exhaustion, ended quietly, without a winner. It simply dissolved. I understood then what joy really did. It didn't create pleasure. It removed resistance. It made existing feel sustainable. When the monitoring period ended, I stood up slowly, afraid the feeling would shatter if I moved too fast. It didn't. The weight stayed gone. And that frightened me more than any high ever could. The fear came later, slipping in through logic once the feeling settled. As the calm held, unchallenged by stress or doubt, my training kicked back in. States like this aren't supposed to last. The human brain is built to fluctuate, to correct, to react. This wasn't fluctuation. This was equilibrium enforced at a chemical level. I tried to provoke anxiety, ran through worst-case scenarios, replayed moments that usually tightened my chest on command. Nothing broke the surface. The emotional responses were still there, but muted, distant, as if buffered by a layer of insulation I hadn't agreed to install permanently. That's when I realized the relief wasn't passive. It was protective, actively preventing certain signals from escalating. Pain still existed, but it couldn't organize itself into suffering. The distinction mattered. Pain motivates. Suffering warns. Without it, the mind loses an early detection system. I looked around the room and saw the future laid out in quiet rows. People functioning flawlessly. Unburdened. Stable. Safe. And dependent. The kind of dependency that doesn't announce itself as need, but as preference. Why struggle when you don't have to? As the dose wore down hours later, the edges of tension began to creep back in. Not all at once, just enough to notice the contrast, just enough to mourn what was leaving. That was the true danger. Not that joy felt good, but that life without it suddenly felt unnecessary. The data confirmed what my instincts already feared. Brain scans taken from long-term residents showed structural changes, not damage, not degeneration, but adaptation. Neural pathways associated with reward and emotional regulation had thickened, reinforced by constant chemical abundance. The brain had learned a new normal, and it had learned it efficiently. Joy didn't override the system. It trained it. The longer exposure lasted, the less the brain relied on its own regulatory mechanisms. Natural serotonin production slowed. Stress response circuits atrophied from disuse. The mind, relieved of constant threat, stopped practicing survival. From a biological standpoint, it made perfect sense. Systems don't maintain redundancies they no longer need. I compared scans taken months apart. The progression was unmistakable. What began as enhancement crossed into dependency without a clear line in between. No warning spike, no red flag moment. Just gradual surrender of autonomy at the cellular level. This wasn't addiction in the traditional sense. There were no cravings, no compulsive seeking behaviors. Residents didn't want more joy. They simply required it to remain stable. Like astronauts adjusting to microgravity, their bodies recalibrated to an environment that no longer existed outside the compound. The danger wasn't malicious intent. It was biological success. The compound worked too well. The brain adapted exactly as evolution taught it to, optimizing for the conditions it was given. And once optimized, it could not easily return. That was the quiet horror buried in the scans. Not that eternal joy harmed the brain, but that it convinced the brain to forget how to suffer and survive without it. The phrase returning to baseline appeared repeatedly in the medical notes, as if normalcy were a destination rather than a process. For former members, baseline wasn't relief, it was impact. When joy was removed, the brain didn't drift back to its old state. It crashed into it. Without the compound, neurotransmitter levels swung violently. Dopamine plummeted. Serotonin surged, then collapsed. The stress response. Long dormant, reactivated without calibration. The body interpreted the shift as a full system failure. Heart rate spiked. Blood pressure followed. Cortisol flooded circuits that had forgotten how to process it. What survivors described wasn't sadness. It was terror without an object, a sense of imminent annihilation. Several compared it to suffocating in open air. One man clawed at his own chest, convinced something inside him was trying to escape. Another begged doctors to sedate him permanently. Standard treatments failed. SSRIs worsened symptoms. Benzodiazepines dulled awareness, but didn't stop the cascade. The brain, trained to operate at a higher chemical altitude, treated normal human suffering as a fatal vacuum. Normal life became toxic. That was the cost no brochure mentioned. Eternal joy didn't eliminate pain. It redefined tolerable existence. Once crossed, the threshold couldn't be uncrossed safely. What most people endured daily without comment became, for former members, unbearable. Normal wasn't a place they could return to. It was a condition that killed them. The truth settled in slowly, the way shock does after the noise fades. We weren't investigating a series of suicides. We were documenting a withdrawal syndrome with a body count. The language mattered, because it changed where responsibility lived. No one at Eternal Joy was being poisoned. They were being stabilized. The compound didn't destroy minds. It replaced a function the brain gradually surrendered. When that replacement was removed, the system failed catastrophically, not because it was weak, but because it had been optimized beyond reversibility. I reread the case files with this lens, and the details aligned. The calm before departure, the brief window of clarity, the sudden descent into panic and neurological chaos. These people didn't want to die. They were trying to escape a state their brains interpreted as unsurvivable. That was the first truth I couldn't write into an official report. If the deaths were framed as murder, there would be outrage. If framed as addiction, there would be blame. But this was something quieter, harder to prosecute. A treatment that worked so completely, it eliminated the patient's ability to live without it. Eternal Joy hadn't trapped its members with threats or force. It had convinced their biology that joy was no longer optional. And once that line was crossed, leaving wasn't an act of courage. It was a biological gamble most of them lost. Understanding that didn't make the case easier. It made it unwinnable. The request to see the medical facilities was met with a pause so brief most people would have missed it. A fraction of a second where the resident escort recalculated. Smile intact, eyes momentarily unfocused. Then she nodded and said it would need approval. Not refusal, just delay. Delay is where boundaries hide when walls aren't allowed. We were shown clinics first, basic exam rooms, counseling offices. Clean, minimal, almost aggressively transparent. Everything visible felt designed to reassure. It worked until it didn't. Because reassurance has a shelf life, and mine expired quickly. It was the elevators that gave it away. 2 of them. Only one marked on the orientation map. The second sat behind an unlabeled door at the end of a corridor no one lingered in. When I asked where it went, the answer came too fast. Staff areas. Later. I followed a resident who didn't realize she was being observed. She moved with purpose, not wandering, not lost. She keyed in a code and disappeared behind the same door. No sign, no camera, no sound. When approval finally came, it came with conditions, limited time, no recording devices, no questions directed at patients. That word landed wrong. Patients, not members, not residents. As the door closed behind us and the elevator descended, I felt the shift immediately. The air cooled, the lighting softened, and for the first time since arriving at Eternal Joy, something was being actively kept out. The truth rarely hides itself completely. It hides behind access. The lower level didn't smell like a hospital. It smelled sterile. Yes, but layered with something faintly sweet, organic, almost fungal. Rows of small rooms branched off the corridor, each lit by a low amber glow meant to mimic dusk. Circadian management, I realized. Even sleep was engineered. Inside the rooms, residents lay in narrow beds, eyes closed, faces peaceful. Clear IV lines ran from their arms to discreet pumps mounted near the headboards. The fluid moved slowly, drop by measured drop, as if rushing might break the spell. No restraints, no alarms, just quiet compliance. A nurse explained it with professional ease. Oral doses were sufficient at first, she said, but long-term exposure required stabilization. Blood levels had to remain constant to prevent fluctuations. This keeps them comfortable, she added, as if comfort justified permanence. I watched a woman sleep through the insertion of the needle, her body barely reacting. The pump beeped softly, corrected itself, and continued. This wasn't emergency medicine. It was maintenance, life support without urgency. What struck me most was how normal it all seemed to the staff. Charts were neat, schedules precise. No one whispered. No one rushed. Dependency had been fully institutionalized, dressed in clinical language and gentle lighting. As we moved down the hall, I counted the rooms. Dozens, maybe more. Each one holding someone who could no longer safely experience an unaltered night. Eternal joy didn't end at sunset. That's when it deepened its hold. It became impossible to pretend this was temporary. The infusion schedules stretched indefinitely into the future, not weeks or months, but open-ended timelines marked only by compliance and stability. Residents didn't graduate from IV support. They advanced into it. The way chronic patients progress through treatment stages that never circle back. I asked what happened if someone refused an infusion. The answer came carefully. They were monitored, reassured, given oral doses as long as possible. But eventually, biology won. The body demanded consistency, and choice narrowed until it resembled a formality. This wasn't coercion in the traditional sense. No threats, no force, just the quiet pressure of physics. Remove the system, and the person collapses. The staff knew it. The residents sensed it, even if they never spoke it aloud. Calling it life support felt suddenly literal. Without joy. Many of these people would deteriorate within days, not from illness, but from the absence of a chemical environment their brains now required to function. They weren't being treated anymore. They were being sustained. As we rode the elevator back up, the warmth returned, the desert light flooding in through glass and open doors. Laughter drifted across the compound. From above, eternal joy looked like a peaceful retreat, but I couldn't unsee the beds below. You don't unplug life support unless you're prepared to watch someone die. And eternal joy had built an entire community around never having to make that choice. Patricia approached me in the late afternoon, when the heat softened and the compound settled into its quiet rhythm. She was careful, as if asking permission to speak, even though no one had told her she needed it. In her hands, she held a folded invitation, the edges worn thin from being opened too many times. "My daughter's getting married," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes did. She explained that she'd been at Eternal Joy for nearly 3 years, long enough to feel steady, long enough to forget how the outside world pressed in on her. She only wanted 1 weekend, 2 nights. She promised she'd come back. I reviewed her file that night. Former history teacher, no criminal record, severe depression following her husband's death, Long-term joy exposure. IV maintenance for 8 months. Every data point screamed risk. I told her the truth as gently as I could, that leaving might hurt, that it might be dangerous. She listened, nodding slowly, absorbing the information without panic. "I know," she said, "but I can't miss this." There was no rebellion in her request, no desperation, just a quiet, human need that joy hadn't erased. Family, memory, obligation. As she walked away, invitation still clutched in her hand, I realized something that made my chest tighten. Eternal joy could stabilize the mind. It couldn't replace a mother's promise. I refused to let her go unprotected. If this was going to happen, it would happen under controlled conditions, not hope. I coordinated with medical oversight, secured a mobile treatment unit, and mapped out a tapering schedule that was aggressive but theoretically survivable. Portable infusion equipment, redundant monitors, emergency sedatives. Every safeguard we could justify without turning her into a prisoner. Patricia watched the preparations with a strange calm. She thanked everyone, apologized for the trouble. That alone should have told me how far gone the line between care and captivity had blurred. People don't apologize for wanting to attend their child's wedding. The night before departure, she received a reduced dose. I stayed nearby, watching for tremors, changes in speech, micro signs of panic. Nothing. She slept peacefully, smiling faintly. As if rehearsing a moment she refused to surrender. Marcus warned me privately that it wouldn't be enough. Not cruelly, not triumphantly. Like a doctor explaining that antibiotics won't reverse organ failure. I ignored him. I had to. The convoy left at dawn. Patricia sat in the back, dressed carefully, wedding clothes folded beside her like a fragile artifact. Her vitals held steady. For the first hour, everything worked. Normal breathing, clear eyes, conversation. I allowed myself to believe we'd beaten the math. Emergency protocols look solid on paper. They always do. They just aren't designed for systems that no longer remember how to survive without what they've lost. The first sign was her hands. They began to shake, not violently, but with a fine tremor that traveled up her wrists like static. Patricia tried to hide it by folding them in her lap. Her voice stayed steady when she spoke, but the words started arriving out of order, as if her thoughts were tripping over each other on the way out. By the second hour, her heart rate spiked, monitors chirped softly, then more insistently. We adjusted the infusion, increased support, followed the protocol step by step. For a moment, it seemed to stabilize. She smiled at me, apologetic even then. "I think it's coming back," she whispered. It wasn't. The panic hit all at once, a tidal shift inside her skull. She gasped, clawing at her chest, eyes wide with a terror that had no source in the vehicle around us. She kept saying the same thing, over and over. "It's gone. It's gone. I can't breathe without it." Sedatives dulled her movements, but couldn't touch the fear. Her brain flooded itself, chasing chemical equilibrium that no longer existed. Vitals crashed in cascading failure. By the time we turned back, she was seizing, body fighting an invisible vacuum. Patricia died before we reached the perimeter, outside. The desert rolled on, indifferent and quiet. In the back of the vehicle, a mother never made it to her daughter's wedding, and no amount of preparation could change the truth. Once joy left her system, survival left with it. Marcus listened to the report without interruption, no visible shock, no defensive posture. He stood with his hands folded, eyes lowered slightly, like a man absorbing a diagnosis he'd already accepted. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough to feel intentional. "I'm sorry about Patricia," he said finally. And I believed him. That was the problem. He didn't argue the facts. He didn't question the data or deflect responsibility. Instead, he reframed the event with clinical precision. Patricia hadn't died because she left eternal joy, he said. She died because her brain had already crossed a threshold that modern medicine didn't yet know how to reverse safely. You wouldn't blame a ventilator for a patient who can't breathe on their own anymore, he told me. You blame the condition that made the ventilator necessary. I accused him of building a system that disguised dependency as healing. He didn't deny it. He asked me how many people he'd saved, who would have died by their own hand long before reaching that threshold. How many families still had parents because joy gave them something to hold on to. This isn't coercion, he said quietly. It's triage. His voice never rose. He never justified himself with ideology or faith. Just outcomes, numbers, survival curves. He wasn't defending a belief. He was defending a treatment that worked right up until it didn't. And standing there, exhausted and angry, I realized how dangerous that made him. Because monsters argue, Marcus Webb documented. Marcus didn't accuse me. He didn't need to. He just held up comparisons and let me recognize myself inside them. Coffee, adrenaline, work that never shut off. He asked how many days I'd gone without caffeine, how often I slept through the night, how much of my identity depended on being needed by people in crisis. You call it dedication, he said. We call it dosage. I pushed back, told him the difference was choice. I could walk away from my habits. He nodded, patient, and asked why I hadn't, why I still answered calls at midnight, why silence made me restless, why the thought of stopping filled me with unease instead of relief. Dependency isn't defined by the substance, he said. It's defined by what happens when it's removed. That landed harder than I wanted it to. I'd seen agents burn out, drink themselves hollow, chase danger because stillness felt like suffocation. We didn't label them addicts. We called them committed, functional. Marcus gestured around the compound. These people found something that lets them function without pain. Society tolerates dependency as long as it's profitable or familiar. Joy just offends because it works too cleanly. I hated how close his logic cut. The mirror he held up wasn't distorted. It was accurate enough to be uncomfortable. The question wasn't whether eternal joy created addiction. It was why some dependencies were considered acceptable, while others were treated as crimes against free will. And I didn't have an answer that felt honest. Marcus led me to the edge of the compound, where the desert stretched out in every direction, empty and merciless. He didn't point to fences because there were none. He pointed outward, toward the world beyond the quiet. Look at it, he said. That's where they came from. He asked me what freedom actually meant to someone whose mind was constantly at war with itself. Whether choice mattered if every option involved suffering. Eternal joy, he argued, didn't remove freedom. It removed the punishment for staying. A cage only matters if you feel the bars, he said. Most people don't leave prisons because they're locked in. They leave because the inside hurts more than the outside. Here, the inside didn't hurt. I told him joy without struggle wasn't human. He countered that struggle without end wasn't noble. It was negligent. We stood there in silence, the sun bleeding orange into the horizon, the compound glowing behind us like a sanctuary. You can leave, he said to me. You will. They don't want to. That was the moment the metaphor shifted. This wasn't a cage built to keep people from escaping. It was a place designed to make escape feel irrational. As I walked back alone, I understood the cruelty of it. Eternal joy didn't trap people through force or fear. It trapped them by making the outside world uninhabitable in comparison. And once that comparison was made, the bars were no longer necessary. The decision came down in a windowless conference room, delivered in language so careful it bordered on gentle. No criminal intent, no unlawful restraint, no evidence of coercion that could survive court. The deaths, tragic as they were, fell into a gray space the law wasn't designed to illuminate. I watched the words get polished as they moved up the chain. Unintended consequences, informed consent, experimental therapeutic model. Each phrase sanded the edges off what we'd seen until it fit neatly into precedent. By the time it reached the final memo, eternal joy wasn't a danger. It was a risk. I argued until my throat went dry. I talked about biology, inevitability, thresholds you couldn't uncross. I talked about Patricia, about 14 names that no longer had voices. The response never changed. You can't prosecute outcomes when intent aligns with care. You can't charge a philosophy. When the ruling was finalized, there were no raised voices, just nods, pens clicking shut, people standing up and returning to their other cases. Suffering had been categorized and set aside. Eternal joy remained open. As I left the building, I realized something that made my hands shake. The Bureau hadn't failed to see the danger. It had seen it clearly and decided it wasn't illegal. That distinction didn't bring closure. It just confirmed what I'd already feared. Some harm fits so cleanly inside the rules that no one is responsible for stopping it. The reclassification happened quietly, without press releases or public debate. Eternal joy was no longer a community under investigation. It became an experimental therapeutic environment operating under provisional medical oversight. A shift in language that changed everything without changing the reality on the ground. With the new label came protections, research exemptions, regulatory patience. Deaths were no longer potential crimes but adverse outcomes, logged, analyzed, and absorbed into ongoing studies. Risk was acknowledged, then normalized. After all, experimental treatments required data, and data required exposure. I read the updated documents late at night, alone. Charts replaced testimonies, percentages replaced names. Patricia's death became a data point in a subsection on transition complications. 14 lives reduced to a margin of error society had decided it could tolerate. The most unsettling part wasn't what was added. It was what disappeared. No mention of dependency. No emphasis on irreversibility. The line between treatment and necessity blurred until it vanished entirely. Eternal joy adapted quickly. Protocols tightened. Language softened. Consent forms grew longer. The machine learned from its mistakes, not by stopping, but by becoming more defensible. That was the genius of the classification. It didn't deny the harm. It reframed it as progress. And once suffering is labeled research, it no longer demands intervention, only observation. Growth followed approval with unsettling speed. What had once been a single compound in the desert became a model, then a template. Satellite facilities appeared near cities, marketed as advanced wellness clinics offering neurochemical stabilization. The language was careful. No mention of permanence. No mention of thresholds. Patients arrived in smaller doses, short programs, pilot studies, but the results were consistent. Reduced suicide rates, improved productivity, fewer hospitalizations, numbers that policymakers loved, numbers that justified scale. I tracked the reports as they came in. Minor complications, controlled dependencies, successful integrations. The system learned how to soften the edges without changing the core, where eternal joy had been isolated. The new clinics were embedded, closer to hospitals, closer to legitimacy. Marcus Webb faded from view, replaced by boards and ethics committees. His philosophy survived him, diluted just enough to be palatable. The question of freedom was buried beneath outcomes and quarterly assessments. What haunted me was how easily it spread, not through force, but through demand. People wanted relief. Employers wanted stability. Governments wanted cost-effective solutions. Joy, packaged and regulated, became infrastructure. Driving past one of the new clinics months later, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. The building looked harmless, inviting, even. That's how it begins. Not with scream, dreams, or resistance, but with open doors, good data, and the quiet agreement that some forms of captivity are acceptable if they feel like relief. The vial never made it into evidence. I told myself it was an oversight at first, a logistical error buried under paperwork and shifting jurisdictions. By the time the case officially closed, correcting it would have required explanations I wasn't ready to give. So it stayed with me, sealed in a small evidence bag, labeled in my handwriting, with a date and a case number that no longer mattered. At home, I put it in the freezer, tucked behind frozen vegetables and ice trays, hidden in plain sight. The liquid inside never clouded, never separated, perfectly clear, perfectly stable. Sometimes I took it out just to confirm it was still there, that the weight in my hand was real. I told myself it was precautionary, proof, a reminder of what I'd seen. But late at night, when the city quieted and my thoughts sharpened into familiar edges, I'd catch myself staring at the freezer longer than necessary, imagining the calm, the silence, the way the world had briefly made sense. I never opened it. I never needed to. Possession alone changed something. Knowing relief existed and was measurable, repeatable, waiting, altered the shape of my thoughts. That was when I understood the final trick of eternal joy. You didn't have to take it to carry it with you. Sometimes, knowing escape is possible is enough to make the present unbearable. The nights were the hardest, without the noise of work. The city thinned down to distant sirens and the hum of appliances, leaving my thoughts nowhere to hide. Sleep came in fragments. When it did, it carried the residue of old cases, faces surfacing just long enough to remind me why I never stayed still for too long. I developed routines to fill the silence, late walks, cold showers, leaving the television on without watching it. None of it worked the way it used to. The edges felt sharper now, not because life had gotten worse, but because I knew what absence of pain felt like. Comparison is corrosive. Some nights I stood in front of the freezer, not touching the handle, just listening to the compressor cycle, on and off. I told myself this was discipline, that wanting relief didn't make me weak, that enduring discomfort was part of the job. But eternal joy had recalibrated something in me. Once you experience a mind without constant resistance, returning to the old noise feels like punishment. I caught myself wondering how many people would choose suffering if they truly understood the alternative. The quiet stretched. My thoughts circled familiar doubts. The vial remained untouched, but present, like a promise I refused to acknowledge. That's the danger no report mentions. Not addiction, temptation, and the way silence becomes unbearable once you know it can be cured. I took the vial out once, just to hold it, not to use it. I told myself that distinction mattered. The glass was cool against my palm, heavier than it looked, containing a solution precise enough to quiet a human mind. A single decision away from silence. I thought about Patricia, about the 14 names that started all of this, about Marcus, standing in the desert, asking questions no one wanted to answer. If joy could be guaranteed, chemically enforced, was it still a lie? Or was suffering the lie we'd simply grown accustomed to defending? The law had answered one way. Biology had answered another. Neither cared how it felt to live in the space between. I put the vial back in the freezer and closed the door. The apartment returned to its familiar hum. The weight crept back in, slow and predictable, settling where it always did. I let it. I chose it. At least, I think I did. But choice feels different when the alternative is no longer theoretical. That's the question eternal joy left me with, the one that wakes me some nights before the sirens, before the noise returns. If you willingly endure suffering when relief is sitting within reach, is that freedom, or is it just another kind of cage, built from principle instead of joy?